What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like it a magic, and today we're going to try to take a deck that we haven't seen alive in about a year now in Standard and try to bring it back from the dead. Here's Blue-Black Reanimator. Let's go. And we're back. Now, I've been excited to play dudes out of the yard since we first saw Blood for Bones during spoiler season. You got blood, we got bones, willing to trade. Now, this is actually a really good piece of value-generating hardware for a Reanimator deck. Now, sure, the real trick in this deck is to get like an 8/8 Flample on turn 4, but what I really want to hammer home about my experience with this card and what really impressed me about it the most was, again, the value that one casting of this card can generate, because often you're going to be sacrificing a relatively inconsequential creature and getting that Villas onto the battlefield while also putting a Rotting Registrar into your hand, and a lot of people just auto-scoop to that because, oh yeah, you sacrificed a 1/1 and got 15 total power out of that trade. But if we want people to stay at our B&B, we have to staff it well. But not to worry, we actually got some really, really good reanimation targets. Again, out of Core Set 2020, there's actually not just Blood for Bones. There's 22 different cards in this main deck that come straight out of Core Set 2020. So, yeah, Blood for Bones makes this deck possible, but on a larger scale, M20 made this deck possible because it also gave us Villas, Broker of Blood. If we're going to be trading Blood for Bones, we have to have a broker, right? That only makes sense. Now, first and foremost, let me just reiterate that turn 4 Villas just like wins games. If your opponent can't do anything about that, like more or less immediately, you're probably going to win off the back of a big old 8/8 dude swinging over and hitting their face in the face for turn after turn. But this can also kill their creatures, draw you a bunch of cards. Like, check out this game right here against Mardu, where we have a Villas down and they attack into us and it just fills our hand up. Here's a couple more fun clips, like this game against Boros Cavalcade, where they do get 4 Cavalcade triggers against us, but we'll take 4, so long as we get to draw 4 cards. That's not good for them, but I also want to point out that this can be pretty good with shock lands, like note right here, where you drop a Watery Grave untapped. You pay the 2 life, but you also draw 2 cards, which is pretty good on a land drop. But Big Daddy V isn't the only brand new crazy reanimation target that we got out of Core Set. We also got Agent of Treachery out of M20, and this thing is awesome. Just being able to steal a permanent is just, it's a little bit broken on turn 4, and there's a lot of things this lines up really well against on turn 4. Like, let's say they drop a 3 fairy on their turn 3, we go on our turn 4 and steal it with an Agent of Treachery. That actually happened in this game, and oh, by the way, that allows you to cast a future Blood for Bones at instant speed as if the spell weren't already broken enough. You want another fun Agent of Treachery example? Here's one where we're able to steal a Sorin from that Mardu deck and then swing for 8 lifelink and put us right back in the game. As a matter of fact, this is probably the play that won us this game. Now, in a regular role reversal for a reanimation deck, we play a 7-mana 2/3 and a 3-mana 7/6 because Rotting Registrar is just too good not to play. This is already a crazy card. Like, the Jund Dinosaurs decks play this card, and they don't even want to like discard stuff out of their hand. They have like almost no benefit in doing that. We totally want to discard stuff, especially on turn 4. This sets up a Blood for Bones very, very nicely. If you just got a 1 or a 2 drop creature, drop your Rotting Reggie on turn 3, discard that Villas on turn 4, play Blood for Bones, and sack one of your smaller creatures. There are going to be other turns where you get in for damage with a Rotting Registrar, or just get in and force them to block to kill one of their creatures, and then you cast Blood for Bones second main phase, get a Villas into play, and get the Rotting Reggie right back into your hand so you can play it on the next turn. Reggie just wins whole games by himself sometimes too, and he's really resilient to a lot of different removal, but if they do have the Cast Down or the Tyrant Scorn or some other removal spell for it, then that's a removal spell they won't have later when you reanimate something else. So this is a great way to sort of bridge the gap between our early game plays and our mid and late game plays, because it gives us this huge imposing threat that creates a lot of pressure just in and of itself, and if it doesn't finish the game in 3 bites, then it's at least going to like eat a creature every time it attacks, And again, that can be a ton of pressure for your opponent to deal with. And once you add a Villas to that, again, games just end. And if your opponent can deal with riding Registrar, one Blood for Bones can either put it onto the battlefield or put like a Villas onto the battlefield and put a riding Registrar back into your hand, which again just forces scoops. But Registrar can't be the only thing that puts big creatures into our graveyard. We have to have a pretty wide variety of milkshakes in this deck. Things that, again, bring our boys to the yard there. So we're going to play 4 copies of Tomebound Lich. This is one of the best reasons to play blue in this deck. This is an impressive card. This is another great way to bridge the gap between early and mid game, and it plays super well on curve with Blood for Bones, just like riding Registrar does. This is a great way to get a card out of your hand and put it into your graveyard so that you can reanimate it on the next turn. But in the meantime, however, this is also a card that loots us. A drawn card is pretty much always good. Not only are you able to drop that Villas in the yard for future reanimation, but you also get a card to replace it, which is actually really cool. This deck wants to do both of those things. Why not? Plus, the Death Touch and Lifelink is a pretty good combination to have, especially on a creature with these stats. This blocks a bunch of early game stuff, doesn't die, always kills the thing that it blocks, and even gives you a point of life back. All of that is really, really, really nice against these aggro decks for making sure you can stay in the game long enough to actually win things. And if your opponent drops a huge dude onto the battlefield, Lich can always block it with Death Touch. As a matter of fact, pretty much the rest of the deck at this point is devoted to serving milkshakes. I'm going to show you all of them at the same time here. We got 4 copies of Stitcher's Supplier, but you probably already knew that. 4 copies of Wall of Lost Thoughts, don't know if you knew that. And then 2 copies of Gorging Vulture. Super excited to play this card because it was my preview card for Core Set, but it wasn't quite as good as I wanted it to be, so we cut it back down to 2 copies. Still has a place in the deck. Decent flying blocker on turn 3 to, again, stay in the game against these aggro decks. And sometimes it'll even gain you all 4 life in this deck because we're playing like 28 creatures in this thing. Pretty good creature count, so it's going to gain you some number of life a lot of the time. And if you didn't get a Stitcher's Supplier, Wall of Lost Thoughts, whatever, on turn 1 or 2, this is a decent last chance kind of card to put a big thing into your graveyard before you cast Blood for Bones. But of course, there's also Stitcher's Supplier. This is probably the card that I want to rotate the least out of this deck. I really hope we get a 1-drop to replace it in the next set. Now, the deck isn't dead in the water without it, but of course, it is an amazing 1-drop. Go ahead and put 3 cards into the yard, and once you chump block with it in a turn or 2, it puts 3 more cards into the graveyard. So it's just a dream come true for a deck like this, and it's a creature we can sacrifice to Blood for Bones a little while down the line if we don't chump block with it in the meantime. So definitely play this, but also Wall of Lost Thoughts is a way to block aggro decks in the early game, extend the game to the point where we can actually cast Blood for Bones and capitalize on it. With this thing that's going to block at least 1 creature every combat in the early game and usually stick around to eventually be sacrificed to Blood for Bones. But it also puts 4 cards in our yard to make sure that we dump something big in there. And you'll have some games like this where things just happen exactly the way you drew them up. You'll play Stitcher's Supplier on turn 1 and drop a Villas into the graveyard. Then you'll play Wall of Lost Thoughts on turn 2 and drop an Agent into the graveyard. But we're not quite done yet because we also have 4 copies of Charter Course and 2 copies of Seeker's Squire. These also will rotate out in the fall, but these won't actually affect the deck as much as a card like Stitcher's Supplier rotating will. It's gonna suck to lose Charter Course. This too is a dream card for the deck. There are gonna be turns where you attack and you draw the 2. You'll want that an awful lot of the time. But of course, there's also games where you're going to play this on turn 2 in lieu of a Wall of Lost Thoughts. Draw your 2 and discard a Villas into the graveyard. The only problem with Charter Course is that it's not a body, so it can't be sacrificed to Blood for Bones down the line, and we really do like having creatures that put cards into our graveyard. But Charter Course will obviously do in a pinch. This is still our version of a Tormenting Voice, and most Reanimator decks want a card like this. We're no exception. As far as Seeker's Squire goes, just a couple of copies of this to fill out the 2-drop slot, give us another body to sacrifice, and something that can drop cards into the graveyard occasionally. It won't happen very often, but it happens often enough to easily get a shot of it on camera like this game. Seeker's Squire is actually able to drop a Villas into our graveyard. It does happen. And we got 24 lands in this deck, and it's all pretty simple here. It adds up to 17 black sources and 15 blue sources and has never once given me trouble. Now the sideboard, different story. I do feel like this could use a little bit of work, but we've mostly hit the important notes here. We play Duress to make sure that we have a little bit more game against control decks especially, but pretty much anything that wants to disrupt our strategy. And there's more than one deck out there like that. We need these Duresses and these negates, by the way, against not only the Esper decks, the control decks, any deck that plays counterspells, mono blue, but also Simic and Sultai Flash. There's a bunch of decks out there that can reliably disrupt our plan, and having both Duress and Negate to deal with those cards is pretty important, but we've also worked in one Spell Pierce so that we can sometimes cast Blood for Bones with a little bit of insurance on turn 5, and that's going to be important against a lot of these decks that'll leave just enough mana open to counter a spell. So I wanted to work at least one more counter in there. Spell Pierce seemed like the most logical choice, but there's also a litany of creatures that destroy or make our opponents sacrifice creatures or other permanents, like Plague Crafter, for instance. This is in the mono black Reanimator deck that I've made. It came down to 3 decks on the Patreon poll this time around. It was either Jund Reanimator, mono black Reanimator, or blue black, and blue black, as you can tell, ended up winning. But in the mono black version of the deck, Plague Crafter is an all-star card and does get sided in a good bit in favor of a card like Gorging Vulture against more controlling decks so that you can make them sacrifice planeswalkers or even discard cards on occasion. Plague Crafter can also be a great card to put back in your hand off of Blood for Bones. That can be a great play if you're just trying to make sure that you can curate the board state to your liking. But for that same purpose, there's also Ravenous Chupacabra. Sometimes you'll even reanimate this with Blood for Bones, but very often you'll just put it back into your hand with Blood for Bones. Sacrifice it to Blood for Bones, put it back in your hand. But there's also Massacre Girl. I've never been good at saying this card's name, but Massacre Girl can just murder everything on the battlefield, especially if you started with a Stitcher Supplier in play. Well, that'll just work its way up to killing pretty much every darn thing on the table, and that's exactly what you want out of a reanimation target some of the time, so at least one copy of that. But there's also a Nezahal in the deck. You'd think with a card like Rotting Registrar that we would not have too many cards in our hand very often, and so therefore Nezahal is nowhere near as good. But I'll show you some clips here. Like this clip is actually, I think, the same game I showed you earlier, but a different part of that game, where we just have all of the cards in our hand, mostly due to Villas. But remember, Chart of Course can draw us extra cards and stuff too, so there will be times where Nezahal is a lot easier to send back to your hand than you might think. But of course, in this deck, we're just trying to get Nezi on turn 4 against decks that we want Nezi on turn 4 against, like Control, for instance. And usually in those situations, we'll have plenty of cards to discard in case we have to abort. But there's a bunch of stuff I wanted to play that I didn't get the chance to play. There's a couple of things I want to point out here, but if we pointed out cards I wanted to play and didn't, then we'd pretty much be here all night. So I want to point out, too, that I'm pretty excited for in general, and I want to get your take on Lotleth Giant and Torgar being those 2 specific examples. Now, as far as Lotleth Giant, I wouldn't mind carrying a 1-of in the main deck and possibly the sideboard, but more often than not, I think it could be worth taking down an Agent of Treachery, putting in a Lotleth Giant, because there's games where our opponent gets down to 2 or 5 or 7, and a Lotleth Giant would end the game immediately because of all the stuff we put into the graveyard with Stitcher Supplier, Wall of Lost Thoughts, Gorging Vulture, creatures we've sacrificed to Blood for Bones and didn't get back. It's just, there's lots of games where Lotleth Giant could probably shoot for about 8 as soon as it entered the battlefield, and so I think it might be worth playing, but I didn't end up pulling the trigger on that one, nor did I do Torgar. I'm a little bit more gun-shy on this card, but I do think there's plenty of things that make this card worth it, and of course, you could play it without even having to have Blood for Bones. But here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 65, which is not too bad, considering that although the deck isn't budget or anything, it's still not super expensive. It's only about 115, 120 bucks to play this deck on TCG Player, and it is well worth it for what you're getting. It's fun, relatively reliable, and can do just insane things pretty early in the game. The reason the power score is all the way up here at 7 is because even though we are playing some slightly substandard stuff, most most of our cards are really powerful. Rotting Registrar, Agent of Treachery, Vilis, Blood for Bones itself, even things like Secret Squire have seen lots and lots of play in Standard, especially Charter Course while we're on that. So lots of these cards have been time-tested Standard All-Stars, and even some of the new stuff has already seen plenty of play in Standard. For instance, Rotting Registrar. So I don't feel like the power score should be too high, but at least a respectable 7. As far as speed goes, a little middle of the road here, we'll give it a 5, because there are going to be games where you don't really do a whole heck of a lot, aside from maybe play a Rotting Registrar or two, and you'll win the game relatively early because of that. There are going to be other games where you play, Blood for Bones on turn 4, you stick a Vilis, they can't remove it, and you win that way in a couple of turns. So the deck can be somewhat expedient. There's going to be other games where you have to settle in, so speed isn't necessarily a strong suit, but it's also not necessarily a weak bit in the deck either. However, Synergy, very strong suit for the deck. I'm going to give it an 8 here because there's like 20 plus cards. I think it's actually way more than 20 in the deck that can put stuff into our graveyard. That's a lot of milkshakes, but again, once we actually do get the big boys out, things just swing immediately. No matter what you get, a Vilis is just too hard for your opponent to deal with, and an Agent of Treachery is often too much for your opponent to deal with if their whole deck relies on getting a key permanent into play. And it turns out a lot of decks are kind of like that nowadays. So just in service of getting either of those two big creatures down as early in the game as possible, we have created a lot of synergistic interlocking elements that help us to do that, and so the synergy score has to be relatively high here. That said, we're not super versatile though, because again, most of our deck is in service of a very specific plan. We just want to play small creatures that put stuff into our yard. Blood for Bones turn 4. Look at that, I have the best creature in Standard in play. What are you going to do about that, Jack? So the deck is pretty much trying to do one very specific thing. And although Blood for Bones gives us a fair amount of versatility in what we can get back, put into play, and even what we can put into our hand, that can be a very versatile card depending on what's in our graveyard. Overall, the deck is not what I would call versatile. On the other hand, the deck is what I would call resilient, and now that's what I would call music. I had to do it. It's stuck in my head, but obviously resiliency is what this deck is arguably best at because of a card like Blood for Bones. If a creature goes into our graveyard, that doesn't mean it's gone forever, and as a matter of fact, if 2 creatures go into our graveyard, we can get them back with 1 card. So resiliency is a very important part of this deck, and you don't have to play things. You don't have to play Blood for Bones on turn 4. You can play Blood for Bones after a long, grueling game on turn 10 and still win that way, and if that's not resilience, I don't know what is. Now, as far as offense goes, we'll give it a 7. It's not like the #1 thing we're focusing on, but there are 28 creatures in this deck, and if you land a Vilis on turn 4, then that's a pretty hefty serving of offense right there. But as far as defense goes, not great. The best piece of removal in our deck is actually Agent of Treachery, and that's about it. Although sometimes just playing Rotting Registrar on turn 3 is defense in and of itself, and Tomebound Lich gives us a little bit of defense, what with the lifelink and the death touch, so it's not like it's a terrible category, but it's not even necessarily an average category, let's put it that way. As far as Game 1 and Game 2, I'm going to make them the same here, because you can often beat decks in Game 2 that you didn't beat Game 1. That said, this deck really, really wants to go first, at least that's my experience. The deck's win percentage is above 500, but that said, there are going to be you'll lose more games where you go second. It just, that is what it is, and I want to go ahead and let you know what you're getting into before you get into it. As far as consistency goes, we'll give it an 8. The mana's never given me a problem, but obviously in a deck like this, if you never see a Blood for Bones, that can kind of be a problem. And there's going to be some games where you get Stitcher Supplier into Wall of Lost Thoughts and they dump nothing important into the graveyard. There's just, it can't be helped. There are going to be games like that, so the deck is far from perfect in terms of consistency. But again, if budget were a category, I'd probably give this deck like a 7, something like that. In that neighborhood somewhere. Again, it's not like the least expensive deck ever, but $120 is actually a pretty palatable price for a deck that actually did end up taking me to platinum. Again, I'll even show you the clip on this one. Actually, I'd been in gold tier for a second here, but mostly thanks to Rotting Registrar, we were able to go into the platinum tier again, so pretty stoked about that. And this deck, again, has been well above 500. I played 10 games on camera to gather resources for this deck. I won 7 of those, some of them against big decks like Esper, Nissa, so really give this thing a shot if you can. It's a great little semi-budget beater that actually has some real action against some of the meta's top decks right now. And if you wanted to do that, then do me a favor. Click the first link in the description. Go over to TCG Player. They sponsor you, dude, and all that. But they're also just the cheapest place you're going to get this deck. So if you're interested in playing it, and I hope you are, then go ahead and click the link. Do that. Even if you don't buy any of the cards, they just like when you click the link. They see that you click it. And they call me up and they're like, hey, Dev, getting a lot of clicks. That's good. And I'm like, hey, thanks. Click. But that leads to like raises and stuff in the future. It's good. Just click the link even if you don't buy the deck. But I hope that you buy the deck because it's a whole bunch of fun to play with. It'll probably win you an F&M here and there. Plus, who doesn't like reanimating huge guys? Even if it gets like Ixalan's Binding on the next turn, you got to turn 4 Evilis, and that's just all the fun in the world. And again, even if it does get Ixalan's Binding on the next turn, you still got a creature back in your hand, so you got a Rotting Registrar too to back it up. You don't have 2 Ixalan's Bindings, do you, opponent? So I'm telling you, this deck just keeps coming at you and has so much value and kind of feels like it's supposed to exist. But with decks that are supposed to exist in this format, there's a million ways you can build them. So it's your turn. Let me know how you do it down there in the comments section. Cards I didn't play, stuff I did play you don't like, all that. Just give it to me as much as you can and stay respectful. Actually, yeah, do that down there in the comments section. And I guess I'll catch you cats later after you like and subscribe, join the Patreon, all that. If you enjoy content like this, it would really mean a lot to me if you just threw like $1 into the Patreon pot. I'll let you vote on what decks you want to see next if you do that. So yeah, it would really help your dude out if you just did that. But even if you don't have money to do that, just like, subscribe, do the other stuff. All that's free. Click the link. It's just completely free. Why not do it, you know? But I guess I'm done for this one. So let me know how you felt about it in the comments section, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.